All right. Yeah, thank you for including me on this great program. This is a paper about DeFi lending. So this is DeFi lending of fungible cryptocurrencies and stablecoins, unlike the NFT lending we talked about this morning. And this is joint work with Fahad and Quentin. All right, so just a quick recap, right? DeFi lending, when we think about it, it's sort of the blockchain's version of over-collateralized securities lending. So what can you do with this? Basically, you can use it to build leverage. You can use it to short certain crypto assets. You can also use it for things like repo, reverse repo, and we might see more of that as treasuries become tokenized. It's a particularly large market, and so this is why we're interested in studying it. And when we think about the DeFi lending smart contracts, there are really two key mechanisms in those contracts. The first one is a collateral liquidation mechanism. This is basically designed to ensure that lending is approximately risk-free, but there's all sorts of issues that could come up. But this talk is about the second mechanism, which is the interest rate setting mechanism. So how do we determine the interest rate that borrowers pay and lenders receive through this smart contract? Now, a key feature of the interest rate setting mechanism is that the information that goes into setting those rates only depends on information that the smart contract has available to itself. So it's natural to think this could be very inefficient, and basically we wanted to write a theoretical model to study this interest rate setting mechanism, particularly for the efficiency, to understand the efficiency implications. All right, before I get into sort of the results, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how the mechanism works. So basically, you have a smart contract. Anybody can supply loanable funds from which users can borrow if they post sufficient collateral. Each loanable market you can think of as separate markets. Okay. Now, how are the interest rates determined? So the smart contract codes a function. Here we use the notation rho, and the function is going to tell you, based on the utilization of funds at the end of each block, what is the interest rate that the borrowers pay. Okay, so what is utilization of funds? It's just the fraction of funds that are lent to the platform that are borrowed. Okay, so if 50% of the funds are borrowed, then that would be a utilization of 50%. And you plug that utilization of 50% into your function, and that's going to tell you the interest rate that the borrowers pay. The lenders, on the other hand, they're going to receive basically the pro rata share of the interest paid by the borrowers. And so the lender rate is going to turn out to be utilization times the borrower interest rate. And so here's an example. If you go to any of these large platforms like Aave or Compound, you're going to see somewhere you'll be able to find these curves for each market. Okay, you have the x-axis above. I don't know why they do it that way. And that's utilization. And then you can see how the borrower annualized interest rate evolves as a function of utilization. So it's increasing, there's a little kink. At this snapshot, the utilization was 71%. That amounts to an annualized borrower interest rate of 4%, and the pass-through to the lender is 2.33%. Okay, so going to our main results, right? We're basically studying two scenarios. In the first scenario, the users of the platform are relatively well informed about the state of the credit market, or equivalently, the credit market does not evolve too rapidly. Okay? Now, under these conditions, you can actually design an efficient interest rate setting mechanism. So it's approximately efficient in the sense that the interest rate set by the platform in each period, no matter the state of the credit market, is going to be approximately market clearing, right? So when you think of an efficient competitive equilibrium that always sets market clearing rates, we can get arbitrarily close to that, even though we're setting this interest rate function at the inception of the smart contract, and we're never adjusting it and we're never updating it, and it only evolves regarding as a function of utilization. So we were pretty surprised when we looked into this, but we also knew there must be some hard-coded inefficiencies. So then you go to the second case. Now let's suppose investors face some uncertainty about the state of the credit market. Here, again, state of credit market is really about the supply and demand conditions for this loanable funds. Once the users have uncertainty about that, or that state of the credit market is evolving quickly or more volatile, then the optimal interest rates setting mechanism is going to have to embed an inefficiency, and it's going to lead to excess supply of funds. These funds could be reallocated for productive use, but they basically have to sit instead unused in the platform in order for borrowers to want to be willing to borrow from the platform. Okay, so if you're looking for inefficiencies, at least when it comes to the interest rate setting mechanism, the inefficiencies does not come from, the inefficiency really, derives from the fact that users face uncertainty about how the states of the credit market is going to evolve over time. Okay, so one key insight here is that, applied insight is that more efficient oracles are not necessarily going to help these platforms set better and more efficient interest rates, right? The oracle, the only thing it's providing is information that the users already have. And so that's not going to be useful for being able to resolve the inefficiency, which arises precisely because the users don't have the information. It's not public information. Okay, so before I get into the model, I just want to sort of talk about, if you just set an arbitrary interest rate function, what are the key inefficiencies that you would expect from the DeFi lending platform and the way that these interest rates are set. So the first one, as I discussed, is that the interest rate setting mechanism doesn't incorporate any information other than the utilization rate, okay, so the basic active borrowing and lending on the platform. And more importantly, this when both supply and demand for these funds, for borrowing and lending these funds, are subject to shocks over time, the smart contract platform will not be able to learn the state of the credit market from observed borrowing and lending decisions. Okay. Now, the second inefficiency arises from the fact that if you want your interest rates to move, right, then utilization has to move, and so you can't have a utilization of 100%, right? You can't exceed 100% because you can't borrow more funds than are available in the platform. And so once your utilization hits 100%, if demand increases or supply decreases, you won't get an increase in the interest rate that you would in a competitive market. Okay, so for this reason, the platforms are going to set at 100% utilization, they're going to set a prohibitively large interest rate, something like 50%, to completely discourage any borrowing around that utilization and basically keep the utilization rate from getting too large. And that's going to feed into some of the insights of how we design, how we overcome some of these inefficiencies. Okay, the third inefficiency is basically the flip side of the second one, which is that DeFi interest rates only fluctuate when the utilization is less than 1, and that's where that's the easiest to see inefficiency. That means there's funds that are being lent to the platform that are not being borrowed at all times if you want your interest rates to be responsive to the market conditions. Okay, so this is excess supply, and that's basically the key inefficiency to look out for. And now the question is, can we mitigate this excess supply or not? Okay, so I'll come back to that. So just to have a quick look at the model, right? We're assuming you have a platform. They're going to set their interest rate function at time 0. It's never going to be updated, and again, it only depends on utilization. We're going to assume the interest rate at 100% is prohibitively large as in practice. And then at the beginning of each period, you're going to have a measure of lenders that arrive to the market and a measure of borrowers that arrive. The borrowers are going to have some investment opportunity, but no capital. Each borrower is going to have an outside option where they could borrow at a different rate. These are going to be heterogeneous across borrowers. And the lenders equivalently, they're going to have a unit of capital, and they're going to have an option to lend off the platform at also a heterogeneous rate. Okay. Now, when they're thinking about borrowing or lending to the platform, they face the interest rates as discussed according to the interest rate function that's chosen. And the borrowers are going to borrow if their expected utility, given any noise in the borrowing rate they might expect from borrowing from the platform, is larger than using their outside option, and the same for the lenders. At the end of the day, really what these assumptions give us are sort of well-behaved supply and demand curves, and the fraction of lenders and borrowers arriving, these are just shocks to the supply and demand curves in a traditional sort of microeconomic sense. Okay, now when it comes to the equilibrium, the important variable here is the ratio of arriving borrowers to lender. This measures something like market tightness. So the higher the theta, the more borrowers there are relative to lenders, the higher the interest rate should be to clear the market. Okay. Now, to facilitate our exercise, we're going to split the credit market condition theta into a known variable theta tilde. That's going to be what the borrowers know about the state of the credit market before they make their borrowing and lending decisions. So both users know theta tilde. And then epsilon is going to be a shock to that occurs after decisions are made. Okay. In the case where the users have perfect information, basically the epsilon is going to be deterministic, and otherwise it's going to have some distribution. All right, we get a nice cutoff equilibrium here, and the utilization rate, the equilibrium utilization rate as a function of the known state of the credit market is going to solve this fixed point problem. And we think this is an interesting, at least academic point, which is that for a large class of interest rate functions, you always get a existence and uniqueness of the utilization rate. So you don't have to worry about setting the wrong interest rate function and dealing with multiplicity of equilibrium. Okay, now, I talked about the inefficiencies that are embedded when using this smart contract protocol. And I was saying that when the users have information, good information about the state of the credit market, these inefficiencies can be overcome. Okay, so how are we going to do this? So the idea here is if we want our interest rates to be responsive to credit market conditions, we need heterogeneity. We need variance in the utilization rate. Across time, we need the utilization rate to move, but we don't need to move it a lot, right? So we can design the interest rate function so that small movements in the utilization rate lead to potentially large changes in the interest rate, allowing us to span the entire set of market clearing rates through a small range of utilization rates. And if we choose that range, we basically target that range to be close to 100%, but never equal to 100%. Now the excess supply is going to be something like 1 minus epsilon, and you can choose epsilon smaller and smaller by adjusting the function to ensure that basically your excess supply is minimized. It's still going to be a positive number, but you can always get closer and closer to zero by targeting utilization closer and closer to 100%. And the consequence of this, because this is equilibrium utilization, is that as my equilibrium utilization in each period gets closer and closer to 100%, but never equal, my interest rates get closer and closer to market clearing and therefore efficiency. Okay, so how do we design this optimal interest rate function? Well, it's very simple. You basically say, no matter the state of the credit market, I don't want utilization to be less than 1 minus epsilon. So how do I guarantee that in equilibrium? I just set the interest rate to be very low whenever utilization is less than 1 minus epsilon. So rho of 1 minus epsilon or anything lower is a very low number. Whenever that's the case, basically the borrowers say, oh, this is a great opportunity. The lenders say, I do not want to lend, and that forces your interest rate, your utilization rate up, sort of showing a profitable deviation from any situation where the utilization is below your target. For the flip side, right, how do we keep utilization from hitting 100%? Well, you just do what the platforms are already doing. You set prohibitively high interest rates around 100% when utilization is 100%. And so basically you get these curves that kind of have this very steep part up here, and then they're very low interest rates for lower utilization rates. So there's already some insights that could be made for the lending platforms in that respect. Okay, now what happens when the users have uncertainty? Well, now the problem is that my utilization rate when I'm making my borrowing and lending decision, this is going to be a random variable. And so I have to understand that some realizations of that variable are going to lead to different interest rates. So if I try to use the previous design and target utilization very close to 100%, well, there's always going to be some realization of the shock to the credit market that would push utilization to 100%, and that would basically penalize me for borrowing. And as a borrower, I'm going to internalize this ex ante when I make my borrowing decision. And I'm going to say, I simply am not going to borrow from this platform because there's a risk that the realized utilization is too high. And so basically to counteract that, you need to target lower expected utilization, meaning there's always going to be some supply problem. And unlike the case where users are perfectly informed, right, the realized utilization is going to be bounded above across all possible interest rate functions. So you can't optimize like you could before to minimize that inefficiency. Even under the best function, interest rate function, you're going to have to basically keep the utilization artificially low, and that's embedding this inefficiency, leading to excess supply or funds that get lent but never get borrowed. Okay. Now, it's natural to ask, what if the interest rate at 100% wasn't prohibitively high? Well, you run into the same problem there, where now if you hit 100% utilization, you're going to have an excess demand problem as opposed to an excess supply problem. And at least with the excess supply problem, when credit market conditions get tighter, the interest rates go up. Whereas if you hit 100% utilization, you'll have excess demand without an increase in interest rates, and so this will be a more severe problem. So you can sort of generalize this insight. So just to quickly conclude, we're studying the interest rate setting mechanism in DeFi lending. Basically, what we're showing is that if users are informed about the state of the credit market, or the credit market has low volatility and evolves very slowly, you can design interest rate functions that are very efficient and produce very efficient outcomes. Otherwise, basically, there's going to be an inefficiency embedded. The size of that inefficiency is going to be with respect to the uncertainty or the randomness of the state of the credit market, or what's basically unknown about the credit market to the users of the platform. And one key applied implication is that more efficient oracles does not imply more efficient interest rates. Thank you.
One or two questions.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. And I just have one quick question. Why is this mechanism specific to DeFi lending? Like, say, for example, is it applicable for example, like suppose Central Bank of Canada or Federal Reserve want to stimulate or cool down the market, like is this mechanism applicable to that? Why or why not?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think, when we first sort of derived these results, like that was the first thing on my mind, which is maybe a follow-up paper, which is to say, well, how can we utilize this, right? The interest rate setting mechanism in the real world, in TradFi, is much more opaque. It's much more difficult to track down. And maybe it could be useful to have a very clear pre-specified rule for certain markets. I have in mind things like repo, where these are large liquid markets. The supply and demand is in some cases relatively stable, and then maybe you would find use there of just having the transparency of the interest rate setting mechanism. But this is a much bigger question, and yeah, it's something a little bit beyond the scope here. But I think it's definitely something worth considering for TradFi. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the great talk. I come from a queuing theory background, and there we also have these notions of utilization and uncertainty. And in queuing theory, people also have this idea that the only way to reach utilization of one is if you have a deterministic system, right? Otherwise, you don't want to have utilization of one because otherwise the delay will increase a lot. So I was wondering, whether there are works that also explore this connection, with queuing theory. Also try to borrow some ideas from there, relating this, let's say, utilization against, in that case, was against delay. Here, I think there are other trade-offs, but I was wondering, if you also there are works that connected to this literature of utilization in queuing networks.
Yeah. So I think I see what you mean about utilization being 100% and being delay penalties if utilization if there's some randomness to that. Here it's I'm not sure exactly the parallel, because there's some endogeneity, right? That like you're choosing the interest rate function. And we're studying a case, the practical case, where you say we're never going to have utilization of 100% in that case, the borrowers would hate if utilization is too high. Now, you could also say, well, what if we relax that and we say utilization is too, the interest rate at 100% is low. So the borrowers are still willing to borrow. Now you get the flip side of the coin where the lenders say, now I'm worried. I'm worried that there will be a huge shock to the state of the credit market. And rather than getting a higher interest rate, now I get whatever this interest rate is at 100%. And I'm basically going to lose, I'm losing out on the opportunity. And so basically ex ante, I'd be less willing to lend to the platform. So there's sort of a two-sided aspect. It's not simply that, if you hit 100% utilization, you're doomed. You could design the platform to not be doomed in that scenario, but it's just who is doomed is the question, right? So I'd be interested to chat more about potential parallels. But that's the only thing I can really think about for that. Yeah.
Thank you.